Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. Today, in part 2 of the video where I show how to paint the greater good Flamesword Battle General Model, kindly sent to me by Wargame Exclusive, I'm going to show you how to paint this fantastic effect on his cloak, as well as the rock details on the base. So as you can see, painted the rest of the model, but I've left the cloak black because this will give us a nice smooth base coat for the rest of our colours to work from. So now the first thing I'm doing is I'm coming in with some Xandri dust and we're going to paint this all over the cloak. This will take a couple of layers to build up to a nice solid base coat, but by working in a couple of thin layers we'll build up to that nice smooth even base coat of Xandri dust all over the cloak to the model. Be nice and careful when you're around details that we've already painted on the model. Just make sure in a couple of layers you build up to a nice smooth even base coat of Xandri dust all over the cloak. So this really isn't going to give great coverage on the first layer, but by working a couple of smooth layers we'll build up to that nice solid base coat of Xandri dust all over the cloak. Don't forget to paint the inside of the cloak at this stage. Some of these areas may be a little bit difficult to reach. Just be nice and careful around the rest of the towel we've already painted, but catch the inside of the cloak with a couple of layers of Xandri dust as well. As you can see, after the first coat, it's really not given fantastic coverage, so I'm coming back in with a second layer of Xandri dust until I build up to that solid base coat of Xandri dust all over the cloak. If after the second coat it's still a little bit patchy, come in with a third coat or maybe even a fourth thin coat of Xandri dust until we build up to that solid base coat all over the inside and outside of the cloak. And after a couple of layers you can see I've built up to that smooth even coverage of Xandri dust all over the cloak. So now the next step is I'm going to shade the cloak. So for shading, I'm going to be coming in with some Agrax Earthshade, which I'm going to thin down with some water. So it's about 3 parts water to 1 part Agrax Earthshade. So really take the edge off and make it a lot less stark. I'm going to paint this all over the cloak. Now you don't want this to pull too heavily in the recesses, but you do want most of the shade to make its way into all those creases of the cloak. So as you can see here, I'm letting it build up into those recesses while covering the rest of the cloak, but I really want to focus this into those recesses until we get some definition into those recesses of the cloak. Now as you can see here, I've got that definition into those recesses, so now I can start working from those shades to build up some highlights. So first of all, I'm coming back in with Xandri dust again. For this I'm placing it on all the raised areas, but leaving that Agrax Earthshade showing in all the recesses. Where we thinned that Agrax Earthshade down, it's not as stark as if we'd used pure Agrax Earthshade, but leave that in any of the deep creases of the cloak. But on all of the raised areas I'm bringing this back up to colour with some Xandri dust. So you can see here where the Agrax Earthshade settled in these recesses, I'm coming in next to them, bringing all of these raised details back up to a brighter colour with a couple of layers of Xandri dust. Keep your Xandri dust nice and thin at this stage again, and use a couple of layers to build up to a solid colour of Xandri dust all over the raised areas, but leaving that Agrax Earthshade showing in all the recesses to the cloak. But doing this step will help smooth out any tide lines from the shade paint that we use, as well as brightening up those raised areas to bring them to a brighter colour. And after that Zandri dust has been applied, you can see we've got the darker areas showing in all the recesses and areas of shadow. I've brightened up the rest of the cloak with a couple of layers of Zandri dust. So now with some Screaming Skull, I'm going to take this and add this into my Zandri dust. So to start off with, I want it to be about 2 parts Zandri dust to 1 part Screaming Skull. So I'm just going to mix a little bit of these two together till I get a slightly brighter colour than the pure Zandri dust. I'm working a couple of thin layers. I'm going to apply this all over the areas that we just applied the Zandri dust, but leaving a little bit of the pure Zandri dust showing at the very edges. Now, if you work in a couple of layers with this, but each layer moving ever so slightly in from where the edge of the previous layer was applied, you'll get a nice smooth transition as we build up to our brightest highlights on the highest points. As you can see, by having this nice and thin, it's not giving fantastic coverage. It's a little bit blotchy, but this is okay. As we come in with other layers later, we'll build up to that solid colour and lose some of that blotchiness to these layers. As you can see, I'm just leaving just a few millimeters of Zandri dust showing, applying some of this mix on the rest of the areas. So now I'm taking a little bit more Screaming Skull again, mixing it into that previous mix we just had. So now it'll be about a 50-50 mix of Zandri dust and Screaming Skull. Going to apply this back over the areas that we just applied our previous step. But once again leaving just a little bit of the previous step showing out at the sides, as this will really build up to a smooth transition as we work our way towards our brightest colours. You can do this cloak any colour you want, follow these same steps. Doesn't have to be a creamy coloured cloak, you can do this with reds or blues. Just follow the same process and you'll get that smooth transition up to the brightest points on your cloaks. See, this process takes many layers. We're slowly building up the brightness in multiple layers, leaving just a little bit of all of our previous layers showing through. So you can see now with that 50-50 mix applied, we're starting to get a nice smooth transition up to a brighter colour. So now I'm adding some more Screaming Skull into that Zandri dust mix. So now it will be about 2/3 Screaming Skull to 1/3 Zandri dust. And once again, I'm applying it all over the areas we just applied the previous colour, but leaving a little bit of the previous layer showing through. You can see how although these are very thin layers, that each one allows a little bit of the previous one to show through, we are building up to a solid colour focused onto the most raised points. I mean, this process will take a while, but it's a really useful skill to learn because you can apply this to fabric on so many different models to really get interesting effects all over flowing fabric. With that layer applied, you can see we're really building up to brighter highlights on this cloak. So the next step, I'm coming in with some pure Screaming Skull now. And much like before, I'm focusing this onto the raised areas, but leaving a little bit of all of our previous layers showing through. As we've built up to about a 2/3 Screaming Skull mix in the previous layer, it's best to come in now with some pure Screaming Skull and we'll be starting that same process again, but for our next highlight colour. So really take your time at this step, because we're starting to work with some smaller areas now. Just make sure you leave a little bit of all the previous layers showing through as we paint some pure Screaming Skull all over the raised folds. With that layer applied, it's now time to add some Deepkin flesh to our Screaming Skull. So much like before, I'm wanting this to probably be about 2 parts Screaming Skull to 1 part Deepkin flesh. Just mix it until you get the colour that you're looking for. Now repeat the process again with this new shade we've created, leaving a little bit of that pure Screaming Skull showing through. Just adding a little bit of this Deepkin flesh mix, really focusing it towards the most raised points and highest folds of the cloak. See, for this I've left some large areas of darker areas just to add interest and to give a slightly ethereal look to the cloak. If you want a much more natural looking cloak, you have some smaller areas of the darker colours and larger areas of the lighter colours. It's entirely up to you how you mix the ratios of dark and light together. For this one I've gone for this slightly ethereal, artificial look. So now the next step is, once again, I'm adding some more Deepkin flesh into that mix. So it'll be about a 50-50 mix now of the 2 colours. With its new brighter colour again. Moving through and focusing this really onto those most raised parts of the cloak now. Let's try and follow the lines that sculpted into the cloaks, catching the tops of each of those creases, bringing these up to a much brighter colour. By keeping these paints nice and thin, you'll get nice smooth layers on the model as well. Which is really what you want. You don't want these to become chalky or thick. You want nice smooth layers of each of the layers of your paint. And so with that mix applied, you can see we really started to brighten up those raised areas. So now I'm coming in with some pure Deepkin flesh. And I'm really going to focus this now onto the most raised areas of each of these folds. So this is now just the very top of any of these creases, catching these with a layer of pure Deepkin flesh. Really focusing this just into the middle of all the areas we've been painting with our previous layers. So after this layer of Deepkin flesh, there's just one final highlight we'll be applying to this cloak. So once again, keep this nice and smooth, just focus it towards the highest points, areas that the light would catch the most, and apply a thin layer of Deepkin flesh. Now that that layer has been applied, see, we've got that transition going from dark to light on our cloak. So now it's time just to apply one final edge highlight, and that'll be with some pure white scar. I'm going to come in and apply this as an edge highlight on the very edge of the cloak. So for these sharp points here, you can use the side of your brush, just get a thin edge highlight of white scar. So I'm going to trace this all the way around the edge of the cloak, giving it a nice thin edge highlight of white scar. And then in the middle of all of these creases, I'm coming in and applying a thin line of pure white scar, just following the highest ridge of each of the folds. This will really make these stand out and add interest to these most raised points. So just follow each of the sharpest points of each of the folds and catch these with a thin edge highlight of white scar. If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. If you would like to support the channel and become a member, please press the join button down below. And with that edge highlight of white scar applied, you can see it's really made those areas of the cloak stand out. Got a really interesting effect all over the cloak to our model. So now it's time to paint a few of the details on the cloak. So for this I'm coming in with some XV88. I'm going to paint these tassels here, coming from her shoulder, going down her back. Obviously being really careful around all the areas of the cloak we've already painted. Just going to catch these tassel areas here with a couple of layers of XV88. And I'm also going to very carefully pick out any of these letter detailings here along the bottom. I'm also picking these out with a layer of XV88 as well. Once again, being very careful around the areas of cloak we've already painted, just picking out the raised areas with a layer of XV88. And with that XV88 applied, that is those areas picked out. So now with some Agrax Earth Shade, I'm going to shade the tassel areas. I'm not going to worry about doing the letters, just going to do these tassels hanging down here with a shade of Agrax Earth Shade. Once that's dried, that's darkened those areas down and added definition to those tassels. So now with some Baylor Brown, I'm going to come in and apply an edge highlight to those tassels. Where they're nice and sharp, I'm using the side of my brush just to give those edges an edge highlight of Baylor Brown. See, for some areas where you can't use the side of your brush, use the tip of your brush. Just make sure you apply an edge highlight to all the sharp points of those tassels. I'm also going to go around the outside of each of the letters, applying a thin edge highlight of Baylor Brown as well. It'll be nice and neat with this edge highlight. You don't want to get this over any of the cloak. Just make sure you edge highlight the edge of each of these letters with some Baylor Brown. And with that Baylor Brown edge highlight applied, just made the letters stand out, as well as the tassels, and added some interest to the back of the model. So now it's time to paint the rock sculpture on her base. So for this, I'm coming in with Corax White first. Being nice and careful around her feet, I'm going to apply a couple of layers of Corax White till we get this statue head to a nice solid white colour. So this will take a couple of layers to build up to a nice solid white. Apply a couple of thin layers till we get a nice solid white coat all over the statue head. Take your time and be nice and careful around her feet. We only want to get this on the details on the base. After a couple of layers, Corax White, you can see I've got a nice solid white base coat all over that statue head. So the next thing I'm going to do is apply a shade. So for this I'm coming in with some Agrax Earth Shade. And I'm going to apply it all over the head to the statue. Doesn't matter if this pulls a little bit in some of the recesses, it'll look like dirt and grime built up in those areas. just make sure you apply some Agrax Earthshade all over the statue head. And once that Agrax Earthshade has dried, you can see it's given a dirty, muddy look to that white stone. So now I'm going to come in with some Corax White again. I'm very carefully going to dry brush over the stone, doing this in a downwards motion so it catches the most on the raised edges to the statue. Obviously being really careful around the feet and other details we've already painted. Just apply a light dry brush of Corax White all over the head to the statue. And now with some Athonian Camo shade, I'm going to come in and shade all over the statue again. This works really well with the shade we've already applied and the dry brush to give a really weathered, dirty look to white stone. And with that Athonian Camo shade dried, you can see we've really got some multiple tones and colours showing through on the statue head. So there's just one final step to apply, and that's another dry brush of Corax White. Being nice and gentle, just catching the most raised details of the stone with a light dry brush of Corax White. So for this I'm using a smaller brush than before, still being really careful around the feet and other details, but just applying a light dry brush of Corax White all over the raised details. And with that dry brush applied, that is the stone on the base painted up. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this two-part video on how to paint the Greater Good Flamesword Battle General Model by Wargame Exclusive. Please let me know in the comments down below, are there any other models you would like to see me paint? Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and happy painting!